Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Adrian's Digital Basement. If you're into the retro PC world at all, you know there's a sound card that pretty much everyone wants to get their hands on when it comes to DOS gaming, and it's the Gravis Ultrasound. Okay, actually, this is not a Gravis Ultrasound, this is a Sound Blaster 32, because I don't have a Gravis Ultrasound. I have a picture of one on my computer there. The Gravis Ultrasound, for whatever reason, is a very expensive card to buy now. And if you're looking to play some old demos or certain games that really work well with that card, well, you're kind of out of luck unless you're ready to splash out a whole bunch of money. Well, in this box, I have something that promises to, well, help ease the pain. This is an open source project that can give you full GUS sound card compatibility in your IBM PC compatible for around $40. So without further ado, let's get right to it. The good old Gravis Ultrasound. Let's just talk a little bit about what this card is in case you're not totally familiar with it. This is a picture of one of those cards. This is the very first card that came out. It's a Canadian company, came out around
1992.
And the claim to fame of this card over, say, a regular AdLib or a Sound Blaster card is that this card entirely uses wavetable synthesis. What that means is it has hardware mixing on the card itself of up to 32 channels. So if you're playing some music, like a mod file, like a tracked mod file, each of the instruments is a sample, and then this card will actually use hardware on the card, and you can see it's not a super complex card, to mix those samples together and give you really high quality output. This type of hardware mixing was really the domain of expensive sampling synthesizers and then computers like the Commodore Amiga and the Apple II GS. In fact, the GF1 architecture here that's on the Gravis Ultrasound was based on the Ensoniq Auto chip, and it was actually an Ensoniq sound chip that powered the Apple II GS with, I think, 16 channels of hardware mixing. The thing about the Apple II GS, though, is it only had 64K of sample memory, so all your samples had to fit in that 64K. Well, the Gravis Ultrasound can have up to 1 megabyte of sample memory, and the original one had these dip sockets here that you could expand your memory from the included 256K all the way to 1 megabyte. The big benefit of a card that has hardware mixing, and this goes for the Apple II GS and the Amiga as well, is that you could have multi-channel audio with sampled instruments without putting any load on the CPU. And in '92, when the Gravis Ultrasound came out, it was a bit of a revelation because all the sound cards on the PC before that, at least the consumer ones, didn't have this type of functionality. I was actually an owner of this first generation Gravis card, and I remember at the time I had my Amiga 2000 and my PC, which was a 46, and I felt that my Amiga just had, well, miles better sound capabilities because of its hardware mixing of up to 4 channels on the motherboard. But then when I got the Gravis card, which could do 16-bit stereo with 32 channels, that just blew away what the Amiga could do. And it was in those early days that people who wrote demos for the IBM PC started taking advantage of the Gravis Ultrasound to really push the boundaries of the music capability and the graphics at the same time, because you weren't wasting time doing software mixing of all those instruments to output the sound through a regular Sound Blaster card. Now back on Wikipedia here, we can see that there were several different versions of this card. The original classic version, which basically just had hardware wavetable synthesis with no other compatibility, like it didn't have AdLib compatibility. And people criticized it for that. And I remember being actually rather annoyed by the fact that it didn't have good compatibility. And I remember very vividly having to keep a Sound Blaster in my PC at the same time as the Gravis Ultrasound, because there was lots of older games and software that used AdLib, for instance, that just didn't sound good when paired with the Ultrasound. It had some software emulation layer, if I recall, that really didn't work well. So there were later versions of the card that did come out, like the Gravis Ultrasound Max, all the way up to this plug-and-play card, which has space for, I think, 8 megabytes of sample memory. And these interwave cards, I actually have one of those that a viewer sent in. I have one that was made by Dell or Compaq. Well, I think it was OEM'd by them from Gravis or Interwave or something like that. And while I got that working at one point, it was such a pain to get working. It's really designed to work with Windows, while the original card was really designed to work with DOS. Now, of course, it worked with Windows, but DOS was its main thing, because remember, in 1992, all we had was, what, Windows 3.1, if I recall, and it really didn't have much sound capabilities anyway. Now, talking about the card being expensive, I just went over to eBay here and I typed in Gravis Ultrasound, and literally only these two cards came up here. This might be the same card, to be honest, because they're both from Poland, but $500 for an original Gravis. And looking at this isn't even the original classic version. This is like a later one that has some kind of crystal audio, which I think was for some rudimentary hardware Sound Blaster and ad-lib compatibility. Either way, you can see the price here is really expensive. And if you go look at the eBay search history for boxed original versions of the card, like that very first generation one, the prices they sell for, well, it's astronomical. It's absolutely astronomical. Now, what does exist is this, and Clint over at LGR and others have covered this. This is a replica card, and it's using that same chipset, the Interwave chipset that's used on that later plug-and-play version of the Gravis Ultrasound. The problem is all those weird idiosyncrasies with getting it set up and working apply to this card and that compact or whatever OEM card that I have, and the original Gravis card, to be honest, because that chipset is not the original Gravis chipset. It's like this later chipset that can, I don't know, emulate the Gravis using ROMs or whatever. Either way, this one is selling here for $200. I don't even know if the original people who made this are still selling it, but either way, even this is pretty expensive. Now, in the intro, I showed this card briefly. This is my Sound Blaster 32, and it has 8 megs of sample memory on it. This is a wavetable synthesis card as well, and this particular card is from 1995. I'm not sure when these cards came out, but I know that Creative Labs was caught with their pants down, supposedly, and had to kind of race to get a wavetable card out once the Gravis Ultrasound came out. The thing that this card has going for it, though, that none of the Gravis cards do, is that this card is 100% compatible with the Sound Blaster 16, which means it's 100% compatible with the older Sound Blasters and the ad-libs. This thing has full and total backwards compatibility, and of course I have 8 megs of sample memory here, so from a wavetable standpoint, this is a very, very capable card as well. Now, what I've heard from people who did software development, though, is that programming for the AW32 line and the AW64, which is the same thing, line of cards to do the wavetable was really difficult, and the API was a pain in the butt to use. Meanwhile, the Gravis, I think, was really easy to program for, or was easier at least. So there's certainly a lot more software that really takes advantage of the Gravis when it comes to loading custom samples and things like that. On the other hand, though, a zillion AW32 and AW64 cards were sold, and in fact, there are later cost-reduced versions than this card. They're like much smaller, and they don't have SIM sockets on them, and those are fully compatible with this card as well. So if you're looking for a wavetable card and you're okay going with the Sound Blaster version or the Creative Labs version, I do recommend these cards because they're really good sound cards in that they also have full Sound Blaster 16 compatibility, which, to be frank, most software fully supports Sound Blasters and Sound Blaster 16. Meanwhile, software that supports Gravis, or especially Gravis only, is very, very small. And that's actually something I want to talk about a little bit. I don't really get personally why the prices on eBay, for instance, are so high for the Gravis Ultrasound. That card that I had when I was young in 1992, I don't remember what I even did with it. I had it for a little bit, but I remember being so annoyed with the compatibility of it and finding that software that used it was, well, there was so little of it, and then things started to really want to support Sound Blaster 16s, so I ended up getting rid of it and getting a Sound Blaster 16, and I don't even know where the Gravis went. It probably went into a box full of other junk, and I got recycled or thrown away, or, you know, who knows. Little did I know back then that the card now would be worth hundreds of dollars, but hindsight is 20/20, as they say. But that goes back to the fact that I don't fully understand what the allure of the Gravis Ultrasound card is, even today, other than the fact if you want to check out some of those period-correct demos, which we're going to do in this video, really works best on the Gravis. But not much other software really works better on a Gravis card. Meanwhile, a card like this can be had for a lot cheaper than a Gravis Ultrasound and offers, well, way more functionality because of all that compatibility that it has, and you're just giving up the ability to run some of those cool demos and things. CPU power when the Gravis came out was such that you really benefited from having hardware mixing of those instruments in the card, so wavetable synthesis. The thing is, in the 90s, Intel was really pushing the CPU power up dramatically, like with each generation. And from the 46 to the Pentium, the performance leap was so dramatic that even by the time the Pentium came out, doing the wavetable synthesis in software, meaning the CPU doing it, and then just outputting the sound to a normal 16-bit sound card like a Sound Blaster 16 was 100% viable. The amount of CPU resources needed to do that hardware mixing actually is relatively small once you get to the Pentium era, where you don't really have a problem anymore. And once you got to the Pentium 2 and beyond, wavetable synthesis became completely unnecessary. So by the 2000, all the wavetable cards were pretty much put out to pasture and just there was no need for them any longer. Now, if the Gravis card had come out with wavetable synthesis on the card in the 80s, that would have been absolutely amazing. And that's where like the Amiga and the II VGA really shined with its music capabilities, because they were both doing wavetable synthesis in a personal computer in hardware in 1985 and 1986 respectively. So it's a bit unfortunate that by 92, when the Gravis came out, well, it was replaced by CPUs doing the work in pretty short order. And after all that talking, that brings us to the subject of the video. What's inside this box is an open source project called the PicoGUS. This project promises to bring full compatibility of the Gravis Ultrasound and more other sound cards as well to a little $40 ISA card that is easy to install, easy to set up, and easy to use. When I was at VCF in Chicago, I met Ian, the creator of this project. It looks like Ian sent me a little note here. And seeing it in person there at the show absolutely blew me away, and I knew I wanted to talk about this on the channel. So Ian went ahead and created a little care package for me. So the note from Ian: "Hi Adrian, it was great to meet you at VCF Midwest. And I know I said I was going to send you one of the OG versions of the PicoGUS, but I realized I had some extra prototype revisions of the Femto version that I really wasn't going to use. So consider this a little bonus. It works perfectly fine. It just has some design bits that I changed for the final version, like the pin header that plugs into the ISA adapter. Enjoy, Ian." And Ian included a little sticker here of PicoGUS, I guess the little pig mascot, open source hardware, and I will put URLs, of course, to all of this that we look at in the description below. So in the box, let's see here, we got a MIDI adapter cable. So yes, one of the things that this card can do is it can also emulate the MPU 401, the intelligent mode adapter. That means you can use Roland MT32 with your PC games without having to buy a very expensive card. Taking the card out of the box, here it is. This is the PicoGUS. Now, this is a prototype. I think the later versions are maybe slightly different. And the $40 version that I mentioned that's coming is going to have everything you see here actually integrated right onto the board. So this is a Pi Pico2040, which is literally a $5 microcontroller board. This board right here is $5. This contains the microcontroller that does the grunt of all the processing to enable, well, the GUS compatibility and all the other stuff as well. And the rest of the components on this board are simply some like latches and level shifters to interface the Raspberry Pi to the ISA bus. You have a DAC right here, I2C DAC. This converts the output of this card into a nice, super high quality, and I mean super high quality sound output. And then the orange jack right here is for connecting this MIDI adapter cable that allows you to use the MPU 401 compatibility. And it has a 3D printed slot cover on it. And Ian included this other board. This is what he was alluding to in the letter. This is a version of the PicoGUS specifically for the little hand 386 board, or computer that is. That's that little recent AliExpress computer that has the 386 processor on it, and it has an ISA bus connector on it, but it's just a pin header. Well, this little carrier board right here, which if I pull it off, there we go. So this right here is for the hand 386. You take the Raspberry Pi off of this board, or you just get another one, plug it into here, and this has all the same functionality as the regular PicoGUS. You have MIDI output and you have sound output on this as well. You're basically giving that little portable funky computer full-on GUS compatibility in something that is super inexpensive. This board here is simply just an adapter from the hand modules, which have a connector just like this, to a regular ISA bus. And then Ian included a little 3D printed case. So if I had a hand 386, which I don't, I could put this thing together like that in there with the Raspberry Pi module and have a full-on sound card for my hand 386. So when you're looking at this card and you're thinking that the paradigm of how it works is very similar to something I've already shown on the channel, you're not wrong, because right here is the Apple II VGA card by David Cooter. This goes into an Apple II bus and uses the same Raspberry Pi Pico module to convert the bus signals on the Apple II into a normal VGA output. Pixel perfect, I might add. And this card, because it's software defined, and that's the key point here, it is software defined. You can change the functionality of this to become a CPM applet card, which is a rather expensive CPM card with memory and a Z80 processor and whatnot, by just going into the setup utility and changing some settings. Now, I heard about another project for the Apple II that's taking David's open source design here, removing the VGA port and all the GPIO lines that it uses, and then adding IO ports to that card. I think like a floppy drive connector, or perhaps serial parallel ports and things like that. And again, because the Raspberry Pi 2040 is a microcontroller, it can be reprogrammed on the fly to do all sorts of different things. And then the PicoGUS, though, also has led to this card, which is the PicoMEM. So I first saw this at VCF as well, and Freddie, who came up with this design, has been working with Ian, who did this design, to make an I/O card for the PC, also using the Raspberry Pi 2040. So instead of doing sound output, it has an SD card, and this emulates RAM, it emulates ROM, it emulates disk drives and hard drives and all this stuff. And I talked about this very briefly on my second channel video where I showed all the stuff from VCF. I'll put a link in the description below. This card is not ready for prime time yet. There's still a lot of work to be done to kind of make this, well, reliable and very functional. So there's a Vogons thread talking about PicoMEM. Compare that to this card, which is a little further along, so it is ready for prime time. There is a GitHub repo, which I'll show in a second. You can download the Gerbers and stuff if you want to make your own, or soon Ian's going to have a Tindy shop where you can buy that $40 cost reduced one. And being open source hardware, anyone can download this and make it and sell it if they want, because that is the beauty of open source. We're not locked into just one person or one manufacturer making the card. And it's actually a really important point that all the parts that are on here are complete commodity, readily available parts made today, currently in 2023. This is actually different than this Interwave replica card here that we saw on eBay, because I'm pretty sure this is using old chips from Interwave, which haven't been made in a long time. So they're like new old stock chips that have a finite number of them left on the planet. Once those are gone, if they're not already, that's it. No more replica of the cards are going to be made in that style. Meanwhile, this card, I just ordered a few more of these Raspberry Pi Picos. They're $5 each. And I think the little DAC on here that converts the audio stream into an analog signal, these are also very inexpensive and commodity parts from China. So looking at the GitHub repo, we can see that currently, well, the Gravis Ultrasound is the headlining feature of this thing, but it also currently can do AdLib OPL2, so this replaces an AdLib card completely. It can do the MPU 401, so that's the intelligent mode I was talking about. That's a very expensive card from Roland that allows you to hook your DOS PC up to the MT32. It also can do Tandy 3-voice sound, so that's that sound chip. It's an AY sound chip, I think it is, in the Tandy that can do 3 voices. And lastly, currently it can also emulate the Game Blaster, which is also known as the Creative Music System from Creative Labs. That was the precursor to the Sound Blaster, and the very original Sound Blaster cards, like the one I have in my 286 there, has support for that type of output. I was also told that Sound Blaster 1.0 compatibility should be coming to this card, although there's currently no timeline, but I think there's some proof of concept work that's already been done to show that it can work inside the Raspberry Pi Pico. We have a whole community of really smart people out there, and it would be amazing if people started porting other sound cards to this product. For instance, how about MOS SID chip, a 6581? I'm pretty sure there was a sound card for the PC that implemented SID. And wouldn't it be cool if it could fit in this thing? Because I'm sure that card is very obscure and hard to get. And with this, there you go. You have a SID sound card. Back on the repo, we have a picture of the PicoGUS versus the ultrasound. And I'm pretty sure that Ian does have an actual ultrasound, which allows him to compare the actual sound output of this card versus the ultrasound. Because of course, it is software emulation that's happening on here, but your PC doesn't know that. The DOS program doesn't know that. But if there's any kind of bugs in the emulation layer, then you're going to have some issues with the compatibility. Which brings us to the compatibility list here on the GitHub repo. Now, this thing's not perfect right now. It's still early days, as I mentioned. And the fact is, the Pi Pico that's on here is emulating all of the actual hardware ICs that were on the original Gravis Ultrasound or on the other sound cards that this thing can support. And there's a big difference when you're talking about a piece of software running on a microcontroller interfacing to a motherboard that expects very specific timing. And when we look at the compatibility list here, different motherboards and things, you know, there are some issues with certain motherboards. And according to Ian, it really has to do with the fact that different chipsets on PC motherboards have different strictness levels for certain timings on the ISA bus. So keep that in mind if you get one of these and it doesn't quite work in your setup. It could well be that there's just an issue with the timing or whatnot that needs some bug fixes in the firmware. And that's one of the really cool things. If we look at this card right here from Creative Labs, well, it's all implemented in hardware. So if you're going to do a bug fix due to a timing conflict or whatever, you got to change the hardware. In this, you just have to change the firmware. And that is what makes all of these cards so exciting to me. Software-defined hardware. Now, scrolling down the compatibility list, we have Gravis Ultrasound compatibility with demos, and you can see lots and lots of stuff is working. But I think there are a few little issues here. So yeah, you know, little DMA issues or things like that. And then looking at trackers, looks like Impulse Tracker might have some small issues. Cubic Player here potentially has an issue, and Gravis PlayMid doesn't seem to be working. So there's definitely work to be done to get this thing fully compatible, but already the fact that, you know, we go up to demos here, all of these demos are working. That is freaking great. The same goes for games. Most are working really well, and there's a few down here that are having some issues, but to be honest, with games, there aren't that many that really require a Gravis Ultrasound to sound good. Take Jazzy Jackrabbit or Jazz Jackrabbit, for instance. When you run that with the Sound Blaster 16, the software mixing of the music sounds perfectly good, to be honest. And if you have a decently powerful computer like a Fast 46 or a Pentium, you're going to have no problem at all. It's possible the hardware mixing on the Gravis Ultrasound maybe sounds a little bit better, but I doubt it. Software mixing is just an implementation of the hardware mixing in the card, but in software. So there's no reason why it wouldn't sound as good unless the mixing rate was a lot slower, like say it was mixing at 11 kilohertz versus 44, which is what the Gravis uses. And then for MPU 401, which I don't have an easy way to test right now, I don't have an MT32, it looks like we have decent compatibility, although probably not a whole lot of testing has been done there. And then for Tandy 3 voice, I'm not even going to bother testing that in this video, specifically because most software that uses Tandy 3 voice sound requires Tandy graphics as well. And obviously I don't have Tandy graphics on a regular PC, and I think there's some patches for games that allow it to use like EGA graphics instead of Tandy graphics, and then use the Tandy sound, which is just not generally something that works. I would imagine there's a set of games that have either PC beep speaker music or Tandy music, and the Tandy music, which is only 3 voices, is going to sound a lot better than the beep speaker. So with that particular narrow range of years, when those games have no ad-lib sound support, for instance, then getting the whole patch thing going would work well. But it does look like, for instance, Prince of Persia, you know, has some issues here. So there's a little bit of work to be done on the 3 voice sound support as well. And then lastly, we have CMS Game Blaster support, and Ian writes that as a rule, it generally works. I actually was doing a little bit of testing last night with Ian, and while it works, I was playing Sylphid specifically, and on this card, the CMS output doesn't quite sound right, and has some weird like artifacts in the music playback that don't happen on my real machine with the actual CMS chips. So I gave that information to Ian. He doesn't have a CMS capable card to even test with, so he hadn't been able to do the testing himself. So there's a little bit of work to be done there, but I think ultimately the highlight feature of this is the Gravis Ultrasound support, and I think that's what most people are going to care about, and that's what I'm going to demo in this video. All right, so for demoing this card, I'm going to be using my 386SX here for the most part. This is running at 40 megahertz. We have 16-bit slots. I have 8 megs of RAM, and I'm booting off my compact flash card through an XT IDE. The one nice thing about the PicoGUS is it's only an 8-bit card, and that means that it will fully work on an XT. A real Gravis Ultrasound, on the other hand, is actually a 16-bit card. Now, I don't know if it's actually compatible with an XT if you just like let the extra part hang off, but this card does work perfectly well in an XT. So if you want to bring wavetable synthesis to your 1981 IBM PC, you can absolutely do that. I'm going to plug the 3.5 millimeter into this cable here, which is going to my USB analog to digital converter so that I can capture the audio so you can hear the totally directly captured audio, and I can hear it through my speakers. Here we are booted up into MS-DOS on my 386SX. I have the PicoGUS installed, and what's really cool about using the PicoGUS is, unlike with the regular Gravis Ultrasound where you have a bunch of, I don't know, utilities and stuff that you have to get working, especially on that later PNP or plug-and-play version, that is not the case with this. Ian created a utility called PicoGUS init to set the card up depending on which firmware is available on the card. So running this here, it detects that it has the firmware for the Gravis Ultrasound, and then it sets it up at IO port 240, which is the normal Gravis Ultrasound-like port. And then all you need to do to make software that works with the ultrasound see this card is set up the ultrasound variable, and you can see it there on the third line under set there. Ultrasound 240, that's the IO address. 1 is the DMA channels, and then 5 is the IRQ that's in use. There are jumpers available on the board to set the IRQ and the DMA channel, which you can see right here, but it's the same on the other one. And if you look at the options for PicoGUS init, we have a few options here for like forcing DMA buffers and also the IO address if you need to change that stuff. One thing that's really cool though is the PicoGUS init utility allows you to re-flash the firmware without having to use a modern computer over USB to flash the firmware. So included with the utility are the different firmware versions, and we do /F and then we do PG, say adlib.uf2, and it is now reflashing the firmware on the PicoGUS card to turn it into an AdLib card. So we run the init utility again. Now it says it is running in AdLib mode at port 388. It does only have OPL2, by the way, no OPL3. So let's run the old AdLib jukebox program here, which was what was bundled with the AdLib cards back in the day. And let's listen to the good old Highways track. Here we go. I'm not an OPL2 expert by any means, but when I listen to the OPL music that comes out of this card, it sounds completely as I would expect it out of a real AdLib card. So let's switch back to Gravis Ultrasound mode. That's all it takes is we just have to run that one command, and we do PicoGUS-new again. There it is. It's now detected as a Gravis card. So now that we're back in Gravis Ultrasound mode, you know the first thing I'm going to have to run, and I'm going to switch to this 46DX266 motherboard to do it. And hopefully you have an idea what it's going to be, because it's honestly the quintessential Gravis Ultrasound thing that needs to be run every time you have a Gravis Ultrasound. So let me swap over to the other motherboard. And this is the setup we're going to be using. DX266, 8 megs of RAM. I have my compact flash card right here. We have an ATI, something or other PCI video card, which I should push into the board all the way. And of course, the PicoGUS. I picked this particular motherboard because it's the perfect setup, like in time for when the Gravis Ultrasound came out. This motherboard actually is a little bit later, from 1995, but the DX266 processor in here came out around 1992, which is also when the Gravis Ultrasound came out. And what I'm about to run is Second Reality, which came out, I think, early or sometime in 1993 and would have been perfectly spec'd to this hardware. And we run this. Second Reality, by the way, is a demo by Future Crew, and it's kind of the demo that I remember running when I had a Gravis Ultrasound, and it completely blew my mind, and it's not working. What happened here? The demo didn't even start. Let's reboot that. This is just to show that I, don't edit everything out of my videos because things go wrong. Things do go wrong. And look at this, the PC is just frozen here, not even rebooting. Let me go try to figure out what just went wrong. We're back. I just turned the computer off. I kind of like bent the board, pushed the things into the board, turned it back on, and now it's working with changing nothing. As I was saying before I was rudely interrupted by the computer not working, I remember running Second Reality on my 46 with my Gravis Ultrasound and being totally blown away at what Future Crew was able to do on a lowly PC. Up until that point, I had never really seen any demos on the PC that really amazed me. I was used to seeing stuff on the Amiga that really pushed the limits of that machine, and they were truly amazing. But I had Amiga 2000 at the time, which only had, 64 colors or 32 colors, depending on which mode you're in. So I didn't have an Amiga that had AGA graphics with the 256 colors. So that was the big leg up that VGA had, but being not hardware accelerated compared to the Amiga, while most of the games that came out for the PC compared to the Amiga version didn't have the sprites and the scrolling and all that stuff. Well, this demo, for me at least, kind of changed everything. And as you can see here, it uses a Gravis Ultrasound with 512K of memory. It does support some other sound cards like Mono Sound Blaster or Stereo Sound Blaster Pro, but it has to do software mixing, which is this sound quality thing down here that has no effect in the Gravis mode. And they even write down there, if you're having trouble with your demo playing too slowly, try reducing the sound quality. So that's that software mixing versus hardware mixing. And this was a period of time here that unless you had a super fast CPU, you were going to be taking away a lot of CPU power from the graphics in the demo just through the software mixing, and that's where the Gravis Ultrasound, obviously, you didn't have that problem. So let's hit enter and start this demo. So even though I'd like to play the music from the Second Reality demo, because the music by Purple Motion is really quite good, unfortunately it results in a copyright claim. So what I'm gonna have to do is we're gonna show the demo running here, but I'm gonna replace the music with other tracked music recorded off the PicoGUS. So we're not cheating or anything. You'll be hearing what the Gravis Ultrasound emulation sounds like, but unfortunately you won't be able to hear the music from this demo. I want to point out that this demo runs at 70 frames per second, but due to my capture device here running at 60 Hertz, there's a bit of tearing and a little bit of juddering and frame drops that happen because of the whole capture setup. So keep in mind that it looks really smooth when you're actually viewing this on a monitor at 70 Hertz, but it's not so great in the capture. So there's some glitches on my capture device with this particular demo. It seems to switch VGA resolution slightly and you get that no signal. This section, which is right at the beginning of the demo, always amazes me. Just like the bouncing polyhedron shape, whatever, with the shading and everything. It just looks so good. It looks so cool. When I first saw this on a PC, I was completely blown away. This is something you would see on an Amiga demo, but never on a PC. And really, it blew my mind. Well, I could go on running demos and games and trackers with music players and whatnot forever on this thing, but I'm not going to do that because it's just a Gravis Ultrasound in a card. The compatibility, as I mentioned, is not 100%. In fact, there's a weird issue with this 46 board. The reason why I had it in my 386 earlier is that on this 46, I can't seem to do the in-place firmware upgrades on this card. If you try, it erases the firmware and they won't program it. So there's some kind of a timing issue, and Ian is aware of it, is going to be looking into it. So there's going to be little niggles and little issues and compatibility problems with this card. It's early days right now, and Ian's working hard to try to fix those bugs. And of course, the more people we have looking at this, helping him with troubleshooting, the better it's going to get. And what's really exciting for the future is obviously more and more products are going to come out using these types of software-defined solutions with this Raspberry Pi Pico. The only problem with the Pi Pico right now, the 2040 here, is that this came out a couple years ago and it's just on the edge of being fast enough to talk on an ISA bus. ISA typically runs around 8 megahertz on more modern computers. It can run faster. That is about the limit of what this microcontroller can do, even overclocked. So everyone who's working on projects like this are waiting with bated breath for the next version of the Raspberry Pi Pico to come out. We don't know when it will come out and what it will do, but let's just hope that when it does come out, it's similarly priced at $5, but then we'll offer more performance and additional GPIO lines so added functionality can be brought to cards like this. Anyhow, the PicoGUS is a frankly staggeringly cool product, and for $40 when it comes out on his Tindy store, or less if you make it yourself, that's just incredible that this emulates one of those like $500 sound cards or $1,000 sound cards, so you can have that kind of authentic experience using a GUS in your old retro PC all the way down to the XT without paying all that money. And then when you're done with the GUS mode, switch it to an AdLib card or switch it to whatever else. Software-defined cards, it's the future, and it's so, so amazing. So huge thanks to Ian for sending me this card. It was great to meet Ian at VCF Midwest and talk with him in person. And I really want more people to know about this project because to me, it is what the retro community is all about. It's so exciting, and I just can't wait for the future. This is incredible. So if you liked this video, thumbs up, but if you didn't, you know what to do. Huge thanks to my patrons. Their names are scrolling up the side of the screen. I don't know, this side, I guess. Yeah, that side. They get early access to videos, behind the scenes content, stuff like that. If you want to become a patron, there's a link in the description below. Subscribe if you haven't already done that. It really helps me out here on the channel. And I guess that's going to be that. So stay healthy, stay safe, and I will see you next time. Bye.